I walked in on my wife being sandwiched between my best friend and her ex-lover, few hours before our wedding. She yelled, "Get out. You're not supposed to see the bride before the ceremony." In one swift move, I made her lose you know that feeling when your gut starts talking to you? Not the friendly, "Hey, maybe grab some lunch" kind of talk, but the urgent, persistent whisper that sounds suspiciously like your conscience after 3 shots of espresso. Yeah, well, mine had been running its mouth for months, and I'd been doing what any rational, soon-to-be-married guy does, cranking up the volume on literally everything else until I couldn't hear it anymore. My name's Adrian. And if you're thinking this story starts with happily ever after, you might want to grab some popcorn and settle in for a different kind of show. Because while I was busy playing the role of perfect fiancé, life was setting up one hell of a plot twist that would make a soap opera writer weep with joy. The whispers started small, like they always do. Just little nagging thoughts that I brushed off faster than crumbs on a 3-second rule cookie. But they kept coming, usually during those quiet moments when I wasn't drowning in wedding prep or debugging someone else's garbage code at the software consultancy where I'd been grinding for the past 4 years. See, when you're engaged to Sloan Whitmore. And yes, those Whitmores, the ones who probably have their own Wikipedia page under "old money that never shuts up about being old money." Your life suddenly becomes a carefully choreographed dance where every step has to be pre-approved by a committee of people who think caviar is a food group. Harold and Geneva Whitmore didn't just plan weddings. They curated experiences that would make the Met Gala look like a backyard barbecue. These weren't people who sneered at your choices. Oh no, that would be too pedestrian. They curated disappointment with the kind of precision that NASA uses to land rovers on Mars. Every decision, from the shade of ivory on the napkins to the specific variety of roses in the centerpieces, had to reflect the Whitmore name in ways that apparently required advanced degrees in social archaeology to understand. "Adrian, darling," Geneva would say, her voice dripping with the kind of fake sweetness that makes artificial sugar look natural. "We simply must ensure that every detail speaks to our family's legacy." What she really meant was, "Your middle-class sensibilities are showing, and we need to fix that before someone notices." I kept telling my mom, "Mara, not to stress about the expenses. I've got this handled," I'd say, trying to sound like the kind of guy who drops 20 grand on flowers without checking his bank balance first. Meanwhile, my dad Luis was slipping me those quiet envelopes, the kind that come with a knowing look and 0 questions asked. To bridge the week, when my credit card started smoking from all the wedding-related charges. "Mijo," he'd say, pressing another envelope into my hand with the discretion of a Cold War spy. "A man takes care of his responsibilities, but he doesn't have to drown doing it." Luis worked construction for 30 years and could stretch a dollar until it screamed. But even he was looking at these wedding invoices like they were written in ancient Sanskrit, work. Things weren't much better. Saira Qureshi, my lead developer and the kind of woman who could debug your code in your life with equal efficiency, kept giving me those concerned looks that said she'd noticed I was running on fumes and stubbornness. "You look like you've been hit by a truck full of stress," she told me one Tuesday, watching me nurse my 4th cup of coffee before noon. And not the good kind of stress that comes from challenging projects. This is the kind that makes people start talking to their houseplants. "Just pre-wedding nerves," I'd mumble, because that's what you're supposed to say when your entire life feels like it's being planned by people who think your opinion is a quaint suggestion. Everything's fine, but everything wasn't fine. Everything was about as fine as a chocolate teapot in Death Valley. The real kicker was watching Rafi suddenly become indispensable to Sloan. Rafael Santos, my day one buddy from university, the guy who'd helped me through calculus and coding boot camps, who knew me well enough to know that I took my coffee black and my friendship seriously. Suddenly he was showing up everywhere, trading inside jokes with my fiancée like they were old friends sharing secrets at a middle school sleepover. They'd burst into laughter at something on Sloan's phone, and when I'd ask what was so funny, she'd smile at me like a teacher grading my patience on a curve. "Oh, just something silly," she'd say, tilting her phone away with the kind of casual movement that feels anything but casual when you're paying attention. "You wouldn't get it," Rafi would add with a grin that used to mean camaraderie, but now felt like a door slamming in my face that I told myself that trust was stronger than suspicion. I told myself that wedding planning made everyone a little crazy. I told myself that watching your best friend and your fiancé develop their own private comedy show was totally normal and definitely not the kind of thing that should make your stomach feel like it was hosting an Olympic gymnastics competition. That I told myself a lot of things during those months. Most of them were bullshit, but I was getting really good at believing my own sales pitch. The whispers in my gut kept getting louder, though. They'd pipe up during vendor meetings when Sloane would share knowing glances with Rafi over centerpiece options. They'd start chattering when she'd get texts that made her smile in ways I hadn't seen in months. They'd practically shout when she'd disappear for quick errands that somehow took 3 hours and came with explanations that felt rehearsed. But I kept turning up the volume on everything else: spreadsheets tracking RSVPs, tastings where I pretended to care about the difference between salmon mousse and smoked salmon canapes, endless discussions about chair covers that apparently could make or break a marriage before it even started. The Whitmore expectations were like a full-time job that paid in stress and came with a dress code I couldn't afford. Looking back now, I realized that those whispers weren't trying to ruin my happiness. They were trying to save me from investing even more of myself in something that was already broken beyond repair. But hindsight is 20/20, and back then, I was blind as a bat wearing a blindfold in a cave during a solar eclipse. So I kept ignoring the whispers, kept playing the part of the grateful future son-in-law who was just thrilled to be joining such a prestigious family. I kept signing checks and nodding at decisions and pretending that love was supposed to feel like a business transaction where I was always the junior partner. The whispers kept trying to warn me. I just wasn't ready to listen yet. But don't worry, I get there soon enough. If you've never had the pleasure of planning a wedding with people who treat guest lists like military campaigns and floral arrangements like matters of national security, let me paint you a picture. It's like being trapped in a really expensive episode of a reality show where everyone's competing for who can spend the most money while maintaining the straightest face. The guest list started as a modest affair, maybe 150 people, tops. You know, family, close friends, people who actually gave a damn about whether Sloane and I ended up married or running away to join separate circuses. But somewhere between the engagement announcement and the first venue walkthrough, that list grew like a mutant plant in a horror movie, consuming everything in its path until we were looking at nearly 300 people. We simply can't cut corners, Adrian. Geneva informed me during one of our weekly planning sessions, which had become as regular and about as enjoyable as root canals. She was smoothing down her pearl collar with the kind of precision that suggested it wasn't just jewelry. It was policy, a physical manifestation of the Whitmore commitment to never, ever doing anything halfway. Think of it as an investment, Harold added, shaking hands with what seemed like every councilman, donor, and minor political figure in a 50-mile radius. The man worked the room like a mayor without an election, glad-handing his way through conversations about property taxes and municipal bonds like he was running for office instead of planning his daughter's wedding. That I started to understand that this wasn't really about Sloane and me getting married. This was about the Whitmores throwing the kind of party that would be talked about in country club circles for years to come, the kind of event that would cement their social standing and remind everyone exactly where they ranked in the local hierarchy. We weren't having a wedding. We were hosting a coronation with an open bar. The Wentworth Country Estate gleamed like something out of a magazine spread for lifestyles of the rich and completely detached from reality. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings that probably cost more than my parents' house, overlooking lake views that belonged in a postcard advertising places normal people couldn't afford to visit, let alone rent for a weekend. The price tag for this slice of paradise? Let's just say it held my throat in a grip that made waterboarding look like a relaxing spa treatment. We'll split the costs, they'd said during our first meeting with the venue coordinator, and I'd nodded like that sounded reasonable. What I didn't realize was that in Whitmore mathematics, splitting costs apparently meant I'd cover everything up front while they handled the coordination and oversight, which, as far as I could tell, involved a lot of pointing at expensive things and saying, "We'll take that, and definitely that." Every decision seemed designed to double the total. Upgraded linens because the standard ones were perfectly adequate, but not quite right for the occasion. Premium bar service because our guests expect a certain level of hospitality. A string quartet for the ceremony and a 12-piece band for the reception because music sets the tone for the entire experience, don't you think? I found myself signing vendor agreements with the kind of frequency that would make a mortgage broker jealous, each one representing another chunk of my financial future being cheerfully sacrificed on the altar of Whitmore expectations. I told myself that marriage meant stepping forward, taking on new responsibilities, becoming the kind of man who could handle whatever life threw at him. I didn't realize that what I was actually doing was stepping aside, making room for other people to make decisions about my life, while I paid for the privilege. "You're being so generous," Sloan would say, giving me those grateful smiles that used to make me feel like a hero and were starting to make me feel like a chump. "Daddy says you're really stepping up." Stepping up. Right. Because apparently, being willing to bankrupt myself for someone else's vision of the perfect wedding was the grown-up thing to do. That's when Rafi swooped in with his helpful suggestions and that confidence that felt like old times but was starting to taste like something else entirely. "You've got enough on your plate," he said when I mentioned struggling to coordinate hotel bookings for out-of-town guests. "Let me handle that. I've got connections in the hospitality industry, and I can probably get us some group rates." It made sense. Rafi was always the guy with connections, the one who knew somebody who could get things done for a fraction of the usual cost. Back in college, he'd gotten us into clubs we had no business entering and parties where we definitely didn't belong. He had that gift for making people like him instantly, for convincing them to bend rules and offer favors without even realizing they were doing it. "Seriously, man," he continued, flashing that easy grin that had gotten us out of trouble more times than I could count. "Hotel blocks, transportation coordination, maybe even some group activities for the weekend guests. I'll put together a whole package deal. You focus on the big picture stuff." The big picture stuff, as it turned out, was writing checks and nodding along while other people made the actual decisions. I was becoming a spectator at my own wedding, watching from the sidelines while the real players, Geneva, Harold, and now Rafi, orchestrated everything with the kind of efficiency that would make a military operation look disorganized. "We want this to be perfect for you too," Geneva would say, and I'd believe her because it was easier than admitting that perfection, in her world, looked exactly like every other Whitmore family event, just with different names on the invitations. That I started to notice things, though. Little things that my gut kept filing away for future reference, even while my brain was busy convincing itself that everything was fine. The way Sloan and Rafi would exchange glances during planning meetings, like they were sharing some private joke that didn't include me. The way they'd both light up when discussing logistics, like they were co-conspirators in some elaborate scheme rather than people helping me plan my wedding. "We should do a tasting at that new place downtown," Sloan suggested during one of our planning sessions. "Rafi knows the chef there. He can get us a private room." Of course he could. Rafi could get us anything, apparently. Group rates, private rooms, special considerations that somehow never required any visible effort on his part. He was becoming indispensable in ways that made me feel increasingly dispensable, like I was being slowly edited out of my own story. But I pushed those thoughts down because this was my wedding, damn it, and I was going to be happy about it if it killed me. Which, considering the rate we were burning through money, it just might. The invoices kept coming, each one representing another decision I hadn't made but was somehow responsible for paying. Upgraded everything, premium this, deluxe that, because the Whitmore way meant never settling for adequate when you could have extraordinary, especially when someone else was footing the bill. That I didn't see the new times arriving behind Rafi's helpful smile and easy confidence. I was too busy trying to keep up with the old times, back when friendship meant loyalty and engagement meant partnership. I was still living in a world where trust was currency and promises meant something. The Whitmores were teaching me a different kind of economics, one where appearances were investments and relationships were transactions. I just hadn't figured out yet that in their world, I wasn't the buyer, that I was the product being sold. The rehearsal dinner was like watching a movie where everyone else had read the script except me. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and realize there's been a whole conversation happening that you weren't invited to? That was my entire Friday night, wrapped up in a bow and served with a side of growing dread that I kept trying to wash down with overpriced wine. Sloan glowed in what she called almost bridal white, because apparently there's a difference between wedding white and rehearsal white. and I was supposed to understand these distinctions without anyone actually explaining them to me. She drifted through the evening like a queen surveying her kingdom from a balcony, gracious and radiant, and somehow just out of reach, even when she was standing right next to me. The Wentworth country estate had been transformed into something that looked like it belonged in a fairy tale. Assuming fairy tales came with a catering budget that could fund a small country's infrastructure projects. Twinkling lights hung from every available surface. Flowers bloomed in arrangements that probably cost more than my car, and servers glided around with trays of champagne like they were performing some kind of choreographed dance. That my parents stood near the back of the room, trying to blend dignity with gratitude in that way that working-class folks do when they're surrounded by people who consider their annual salary to be pocket change. Mom wore the dress she'd bought specifically for this weekend, navy blue with tiny pearl buttons, purchased after 3 separate shopping trips and endless debates about what would be appropriate for the occasion. Dad had his good suit on, the one he usually reserved for funerals and job interviews, and he kept tugging at his tie like it was trying to strangle him. Beautiful venue, Mom said to Geneva during one of those awkward small talk moments that happen when 2 different worlds collide at the same party. You've really outdone yourselves. Well, we wanted everything to be perfect for the children, Geneva replied with that smile that managed to be both gracious and dismissive at the same time. Adrian has such lovely parents. So authentic. Authentic, right? Because apparently, being middle class was like being an artisanal cheese, something quaint and genuine that rich people could appreciate from a safe distance. I was nursing my second glass of wine and trying to look like I belonged at my own rehearsal dinner when Teo Benson, the venue's AV tech, approached me with that look that service industry professionals get when they're about to make your life either much easier or much more complicated. "Hey, Adrian," he said, extending a hand that had the kind of firm grip that suggested he actually worked for a living. "I wanted to walk you through tomorrow's slideshow setup. We've got everything queued up, your engagement photos, family pictures, the whole timeline you guys put together." He led me over to a control booth that looked like mission control for a small space program, complete with enough buttons and switches to launch a satellite. "We can cue anything you want," he explained, pointing to various monitors and input devices. "Music, videos, photo sequences, whatever. You just give me a signal during the reception, and we can make it happen." Something about the way he said it made me file that information away without really knowing why. Maybe it was the professional competence in his voice, or maybe it was just nice to talk to someone who seemed genuinely interested in making sure things went smoothly instead of just looking good for the cameras. "Just give me a signal," he repeated, and I nodded like I understood what I might possibly need to signal him about. At that point, I was still thinking in terms of maybe wanting to skip a particularly embarrassing childhood photo or extend the first dance music if the moment felt right. That I had no idea that 24 hours later, I'd be giving him a very different kind of signal. The evening progressed with the kind of orchestrated perfection that the Whitmores specialized in, speeches that hit all the right notes, toasts that managed to be both heartfelt and appropriately brief, and enough networking opportunities to make a political fundraiser jealous. Harold worked the room like he was running for office, while Geneva floated from group to group, ensuring that everyone felt appropriately welcomed and subtly reminded of their place in the social hierarchy. But then things started to feel off in ways I couldn't quite put my finger on. Little moments that probably meant nothing but felt like everything when you strung them together. Around 9:30, Sloane suddenly looked flushed and overwhelmed, pressing her hand to her chest like she couldn't quite catch her breath. "I need some air," she announced, giving me one of those apologetic smiles that was supposed to be reassuring but somehow wasn't. Just feeling a little overwhelmed by everything. You know how it is. I offered to come with her, because that's what concerned fiancés do when their partners need air, but she waved me off with a laugh that sounded just a little too rehearsed. "Don't be silly. Stay here and enjoy the party. I'll just step outside for a few minutes and collect myself." She kissed my cheek, the kind of quick, distracted kiss you give someone when you're already mentally somewhere else, and disappeared through the French doors that led to the estate's gardens. I watched her go, telling myself that pre-wedding jitters were totally normal and definitely not a sign that something was fundamentally wrong with the picture we were painting. About 10 minutes later, I realized I hadn't seen Rafi in a while either. He'd been working the room earlier, charming bridesmaids, and impressing groomsmen with stories about his latest business ventures. But now his distinctive laugh was nowhere to be heard above the general party noise. "Have you seen Rafi?" I asked Marcus, one of my groomsmen, who was working on his third beer and looking like he was actually enjoying himself. "He stepped out a little while ago," Marcus replied, gesturing vaguely toward the same French doors where Sloan had disappeared. "Said he needed to make some calls about tomorrow's transportation logistics. Guy never stops working, does he? Transportation logistics. Right. Because apparently, coordinating hotel shuttles required the kind of privacy that could only be found in moonlit gardens during your best friend's rehearsal dinner, that I tried to shake off the feeling that was crawling up my spine like a spider made of pure anxiety. This was my rehearsal dinner, damn it. These were my people, celebrating my upcoming marriage to the woman I loved. Everything was fine. Everything was going according to plan. Except my gut was screaming that the plan had changed, and nobody had bothered to give me the updated script. When Sloan returned about 20 minutes later, she looked perfectly composed, her color back to normal, and her smile bright enough to power a small city. "Much better," she announced, rejoining our conversation like she'd never left. "Just needed a moment to decompress." Rafi reappeared a few minutes after that, sliding back into the party with his usual easy confidence. "Sorry about that," he said when someone asked where he'd been. "Had to handle some last-minute details for tomorrow. You know how it is with these big events. Always something that needs attention." One of the bridesmaids, Jessica, I think, gave me a look that felt loaded with meaning I couldn't decode. "Sloan seemed a little overwhelmed earlier," she said carefully. "Everything okay?" "Just pre-wedding nerves," I replied, because that's what you're supposed to say when your fiancée disappears during her own rehearsal dinner and returns looking like she's been doing breathing exercises. "Totally normal." Jessica nodded, but there was something in her expression that suggested she thought my definition of totally normal might need some adjustment. "Of course," she said. "Pre-wedding nerves." It sounded like a script for people who don't like asking awkward questions at inappropriate times, which, apparently, included me. My stomach tightened with something that felt suspiciously like dread, then immediately pretended it was just hunger or too much wine or the perfectly reasonable anxiety that comes with getting married in front of 300 people. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of handshakes and hugs, final confirmations and last-minute adjustments. Everyone assuring me that tomorrow was going to be perfect, and I was the luckiest guy in the world that I went to bed that night telling myself they were. Right up by the next afternoon, I'd learned exactly how wrong we all were. You know how sometimes technology saves your ass in ways you never saw coming? Like when your phone autocorrects something embarrassing before you send it, or when your GPS reroutes you around a massive traffic jam. Well, social media, specifically Instagram stories, and the beautiful stupidity of people who think they're smarter than they actually are, was about to become my personal guardian angel. It was around 11 a.m. on what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, and I was sitting in my apartment trying to choke down some coffee and a bagel while my stomach did interpretive dance routines that would make Cirque du Soleil jealous. Wedding day nerves, I told myself. Totally normal. Happens to everyone. I was mindlessly scrolling through Instagram, because that's what you do when you're trying to distract yourself from the fact that in 4 hours you'll be standing in front of 300 people promising to love someone forever, when Sloan's story popped up. Just a quick flash, the kind of blink and you'll miss it post that people throw up when they're not really thinking about what they're sharing. It was nothing, really. Just a random shot of what looked like hotel carpet. That generic beige pattern with little geometric shapes that screams, mid-tier business hotel, trying too hard to look fancy. There was a slice of brass door hardware in the corner, the kind of pretentious sconce lighting that interior designers think makes places look classy, and just barely visible at the edge of the frame, part of a door number. The story disappeared almost immediately. Like, I'm talking maybe 3 seconds of airtime before it was gone, deleted faster than evidence at a congressional hearing. But I'd seen it. And more importantly, I'd seen the numbers. 11. Something. The image had vanished too quickly to make out the full room number, but it was definitely the 11th floor of somewhere. Now, any rational person would have shrugged this off as meaningless social media noise. Sloan was probably just posting random stuff while getting ready at her parents' house, right? Maybe she was staying at a hotel the night before to maintain that whole groom shouldn't see the bride Tradition that seemed incredibly important to people who thought superstition was more reliable than actual communication. But here's the thing about gut feelings. They don't give a damn about rational explanations. My gut was currently doing the equivalent of air raid sirens, and it had been getting louder ever since last night's mysterious disappearing act during the rehearsal dinner. I did what any modern paranoid fiancé would do. I started thinking about who had access to hotel information. And wouldn't you know it, Rafi had handled all the hotel bookings for out-of-town guests. Rafi, who knew which properties, which room blocks, which floors everyone was staying on. The boutique hotel in the historic district. The one he'd recommended because he knew the manager and could get us exceptional rates for the wedding party. The one where he'd personally handled the room assignments because he was just so damn helpful with everything. I sat there for about 10 minutes, having a full internal debate between the rational side of my brain, which was insisting this was wedding day paranoia, and the suspicious side, which was pointing out that a lot of weird coincidences had been piling up lately. Rational brain was losing. I drove to the hotel. Because apparently, I'm the kind of guy who follows mysterious Instagram clues on his wedding day instead of getting a massage or doing whatever normal grooms do to relax before the biggest commitment of their lives. The parking lot of the Meridian Boutique Hotel looked like a luxury car showcase. BMWs, Mercedes, a couple of Audis, and right there in the corner, parked like it belonged, was Rafi's black Infiniti. The same car I'd helped him pick out 2 years ago when he got his promotion. The same car that was supposed to be at his hotel room while he got ready for my wedding. I sat in my car for a few minutes, giving rational brain one last chance to convince me I was being crazy. Maybe he was here helping other wedding guests with something. Maybe he was coordinating last-minute transportation details. Maybe there was a perfectly innocent explanation for why my best friend was at a boutique hotel 4 hours before my wedding instead of getting ready like everyone else. But my gut had moved beyond whispers. It was now broadcasting at full volume, and the message was crystal clear: go upstairs. Find out what's really going on. The elevator ride to the 11th floor felt like it took approximately 7 years. I watched the numbers climb, 5, 6, 7, while my heart rate climbed right along with them. By the time I reached 11, I was sweating like a marathon runner in Death Valley. The hallway was that particular kind of quiet you only get in expensive hotels, where the carpet is thick enough to muffle footsteps and the walls are designed to keep secrets. I walked slowly past the room numbers, 1117, 1118, and there it was, 1119. I stood outside that door for what felt like forever, listening to my own heartbeat and trying to decide if I was about to ruin my wedding day over nothing or discover something that would ruin it in a completely different way. That's when I noticed the door wasn't completely closed. Not wide open, but not properly latched either. Just that little gap that happens when someone closes a door quickly and doesn't check to make sure it actually caught. The kind of careless mistake people make when they're distracted by other activities. That I pushed it open just enough to see inside. And that's when my world shifted off its axis and tumbled into a completely different universe. Sloane was there. My fiancée, who was supposed to be getting her hair done and drinking champagne with her bridesmaids. She was very much not getting her hair done. Rafi was there too. My best friend, who was supposed to be helping me with last-minute preparations and making sure everything went smoothly for the biggest day of my life. And there was a third person, Julian, Sloane's ex-boyfriend from college. The one she dated for 2 years before we met. The one who'd remained friends with her despite their history. The one who'd somehow ended up on our wedding guest list because cutting him out would have been unnecessarily dramatic. They were tangled together on that hotel bed like some kind of human pretzel, and let me tell you, there was nothing ambiguous about what was happening. This wasn't a friendly conversation that had gotten out of hand. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be explained away with creative storytelling. This was betrayal with a capital B, wrapped in skin and served with a side of "your entire life is a lie." I didn't shout. I didn't bang on the door or demand explanations or do any of the dramatic shit you see in movies. Instead, I did what any tech-savvy millennial would do in 2024. I pulled out my phone and started recording. The video quality wasn't great. Hotel lighting is notoriously terrible for amateur cinematography, but it captured everything that mattered. Faces, voices, the bedside clock showing the date and time, and most importantly, the conversation that was happening while they thought they were alone. Sloane laughed. actually laughed when Julian said something about no one stopping this now. It was the kind of carefree, genuine laugh I hadn't heard from her in months. The kind of laugh that used to be reserved for me. He'd never guess, Rafi murmured, and there was something almost affectionate in his voice. Adrian's too trusting, too focused on doing the right thing. Too trusting, right? Because apparently, believing that your best friend and your fiancé weren't conspiring to destroy your life while you paid for their entertainment was a character flaw that I recorded about 30 seconds of footage, enough to document what was happening without turning into some kind of creepy voyeur, then backed away from the door as quietly as I'd approached it. The elevator ride down felt different than the ride up. Going up, I'd been anxious and suspicious. Going down, I was carrying an unexploded device that could detonate my entire existence. That I sat in my car in that parking lot for a long time, watching the footage over and over again, making sure I hadn't somehow misunderstood what I'd seen. But there was no misunderstanding. There was no alternative interpretation. There was just the truth, captured in high definition and timestamped for posterity. My wedding was in 3 hours, and I had some planning to do. There's something weirdly therapeutic about a 24-hour diner at noon on what was supposed to be your wedding day. The fluorescent lights buzz with the kind of consistent white noise that drowns out the screaming in your head, and the coffee is strong enough to keep you functional while your entire world implodes in slow motion. Plus, nobody at Mel's all-night diner gives a damn if you're having an existential crisis over scrambled eggs and hash browns. That I claimed a corner booth with a view of the parking lot. Old habit from too many late-night study sessions in college, and pulled out my phone to watch the video again. 4th time, 5th time, maybe 10th. I'd lost count somewhere between denial and acceptance, but the footage never changed. Sloan, Rafi, Julian. Hotel room 1119. Yesterday's date and this morning's timestamp. Mathematical proof that my life had been a carefully orchestrated lie. The waitress. Her name tag said Dolores, and she had the look of someone who'd seen every possible human disaster at least twice. Kept my coffee cup filled without asking questions. God bless career service industry professionals who understand that sometimes people need to sit in public places and process their personal apocalypses in peace. That I opened the Notes app on my phone and started writing. First draft was pure rage. All the things I wanted to scream at them. All the ways I wanted to burn their lives down with the same methodical precision they'd used to demolish mine. But revenge fantasies don't make good action plans, and I deleted that mess before it could contaminate my actual thinking. Second draft was better, calmer, more surgical. The plan I eventually settled on was written on a paper napkin first, because sometimes you need to see your strategy in physical form before you commit to digital permanence. It was elegant in its simplicity. No chaos, no screaming matches, no Jerry Springer-style confrontations that would give people something to gossip about for years. Just truth, consequences, and a demonstration of what happens when you bet against someone who actually understands how modern life works. That I pulled out my phone and started making a list of everything I legally controlled. Turns out, when you're the kind of guy who handles logistics and pays attention to details, you end up with more leverage than people realize. First, the venue balance. The Wentworth Country Estate required a final payment 48 hours before the event, and guess whose credit card was on file for that transaction? Mine. Not the Whitmore's, despite all their talk about splitting costs. Mine. The card that I could cancel with a single phone call and a security code. Second, the live AV setup. Teo had walked me through the control system last night, explaining how he could cue anything I wanted with just a signal. Anything, he'd said, and I was about to take him up on that offer in ways he probably hadn't anticipated. Third, the chartered shuttle service for out-of-town guests. 3 buses, booked and paid for by me, scheduled to run loops between the hotel and the venue all afternoon and evening. Transportation that 150 people were counting on, coordinated through a company that knew my voice and would accept my instructions without question. Fourth, the honeymoon itinerary. Flight confirmations, hotel reservations, excursion bookings, all in my name, all connected to my credit cards and frequent flyer accounts. 2 weeks in Greece that could be transferred, canceled, or redirected with about 15 minutes of phone calls. That I started queuing up cancellation windows and transfer options, setting alerts on our joint checking account. and preparing a statement that would be shorter than the pain but sharper than any rumor mill could manufacture. The beauty of the plan was its precision. No collateral damage to innocent people, no nuclear options that would hurt my parents or the wedding guests who'd traveled here in good faith. Just a careful dismantling of the infrastructure that was supposed to support a lie, handed back to the people who'd helped create it. I texted my cousin Nia. Hey, weird favor. Can you keep an eye on mom and dad at the ceremony today? Make sure they're okay and get them out of there if things get weird. She texted back immediately. Everything all right? You sound stressed. Just wedding day nerves. I replied, because at this point I was getting really good at saying that. Probably nothing, but I'd feel better knowing someone's looking out for them. Of course, they'll be fine. You focus on marrying that girl and being happy. If only it were that simple. I spent the next hour researching contract clauses and cancellation policies, because apparently my computer science degree and 4 years of reading software licensing agreements had prepared me for more than just debugging code. The venue contract was particularly interesting. There was a penalty clause that shifted financial responsibility to whichever party added last-minute changes or upgrades after the initial agreement. Guess who had insisted on upgrading literally everything in the final 2 weeks? The Whitmores, who'd signed addendums putting their names on all the fancy additions they couldn't live without. The joint bank account we'd opened for household expenses had protections in place that prevented either party from making major withdrawals without both signatures, except in cases of documented infidelity, which voided the shared responsibility clause. Amazing how thorough you can be when you're planning a life with someone you trust completely. The insurance rider I'd added to my life insurance policy had seemed like responsible planning at the time. Remove Sloan as beneficiary until after the wedding ceremony was officially completed, then automatically reinstate her once we were legally married. Just a precaution to make sure everything was properly documented. I'd never imagined I'd be grateful for that particular bit of paranoia that I pulled up the contact list for Sloan's 3 main event sponsors: the florist, the photographer, and the catering coordinator who'd offered discounted services in exchange for brand alignment and social media exposure. Each of them had contracts with signature pages that included both my name and Harold's. Because the Whitmores had insisted on being involved in every vendor relationship, that I drafted a brief, professional email. Due to personal circumstances, I'm withdrawing from today's event. Please direct all remaining invoices and coordination requests to the Whitmore family per our signed addendum agreements. Thank you for your understanding. Clean. Simple. Legally airtight, since Harold had indeed signed addendums taking responsibility for vendor relationships when he'd insisted on being involved in every decision. The final piece was the hardest, figuring out how to tell 300 people that their afternoon was about to take an unexpected turn. The truth would speak for itself. I just needed to make sure it had the right platform and the right timing. I finished my coffee, left a $20 tip for Dolores, who deserved hazard pay for dealing with my personal crisis, and drove back to my apartment to change into my wedding suit. Because if you're going to blow up your own life, you might as well look good doing it. I had about 90 minutes before showtime, and a dozen phone calls to make. Each one would be quick, professional, and irreversible. By the time I was done, the only thing left would be walking into that ballroom and letting everyone see what 3 people had been doing while the rest of us planned a celebration. My hands were steady as I reached for my phone. My conscience was clear. My gut had finally stopped whispering. Now it was time to listen. The Wentworth Country Estate looked like something out of a fever dream. The kind of place where money goes to show off in front of other money while pretending it's all about love and tradition. Every surface gleamed with the kind of polish that screams, "We spent more on decorations than most people make in a year." And the whole place hummed with that particular energy you get when 300 people are dressed in their finest clothes, ready to witness what they think is going to be a fairy tale wedding. I stood in the groom's preparation room, adjusting my tie for the 5th time and watching the clock count down to showtime. 2 o'clock. In about 30 minutes, I was supposed to walk down that aisle and promise to love, honor, and cherish someone who was currently in room 1119 of a boutique hotel, probably getting ready to pretend she'd spent the morning with her bridesmaids instead of tangled up with my best friend and her ex-boyfriend. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was about to give the performance of my lifetime at an event where everyone else had apparently been acting for months. Through the window, I could see guests. arriving in their luxury cars and designer outfits. Air kissing and networking like this was a political fundraiser with better catering. The photographer was already working the crowd, capturing those candid moments that would look spontaneous in the wedding album, but were actually as choreographed as a Broadway show. Harold was in full politician mode, working the room like he was running for mayor of Rich People Land. He'd found his natural habitat among the donors and councilmen, discussing municipal bonds and property development deals like they were the real reason everyone had gathered here today. Geneva floated nearby in her lilac silk mother-of-the-bride dress, radiating the kind of satisfied approval that comes from knowing your social event was going to be talked about in the right circles for years. The officiant, some friend of Harold's who probably married rich people as a hobby, was fussing with his notes and checking his watch. He'd practiced our ceremony script 3 times yesterday, making sure every word reflected the dignity and tradition that the Whitmore family expected. What he didn't know was that he was about to officiate the shortest wedding ceremony in Wentworth country estate history. I could hear the string quartet tuning up in the ballroom, preparing to play the processional music that was supposed to make everyone cry happy tears when Sloane walked down the aisle in her $10,000 dress. The same dress she'd probably been trying not to wrinkle while she was busy destroying our relationship in a hotel room across town. My phone buzzed with a text from Mia. Mom and Dad are seated. They look nervous but happy. Dad keeps adjusting his tie just like you do. Everything ready on your end? Almost, I texted back. Remember what I said about keeping them close, okay? You're worrying me, cuz. What's going on? You'll see. Just trust me and make sure they're okay. I pocketed my phone and walked out of the preparation room toward the ballroom, nodding at the various coordinators and vendors who were making final adjustments to what was supposed to be the perfect wedding. Everyone smiled at me with that special kind of enthusiasm reserved for grooms. Like I was about to embark on the greatest adventure of my life instead of about to detonate a social nuclear bomb in front of half the city's elite. The ballroom was a masterpiece of expensive taste and careful coordination. Crystal chandeliers cast perfect lighting over tables that probably cost more to set than most people's monthly rent. Flowers bloomed in arrangements that looked like they'd been designed by artists instead of florists, and everything sparkled with the kind of understated elegance that only comes from having unlimited resources and questionable priorities that I found Teo at his AV station, running final checks on the sound system and the projection setup. He looked up when I approached, giving me that professional smile that said he was ready to make everything run smoothly. All set for the slideshow, he said, gesturing to the massive screen that dominated one wall of the ballroom. We've got your engagement photos queued up, family pictures, the whole timeline you put together. Just give me the signal during the reception, and we'll run through everything. Actually, I said, pulling out my phone, there's been a change of plans. I need you to play something else instead. I handed him the phone with the video file already selected. This needs to go up on the main screen when I give you the signal. Can you do that? Teo looked at the phone, then at me, and something in his expression shifted. He was a professional who'd probably worked hundreds of events, and he could recognize the difference between a nervous groom making last-minute changes and something bigger going down. You sure about this? He asked quietly. Never been more sure of anything in my life, I replied. When I get to the microphone on the mezzanine and signal you, play the video. Full screen, full volume. Can you handle that? He nodded slowly. I can handle it. But are you sure you want to handle what comes after? I've been handling it all morning, I said. This is just the part where everyone else gets to see what I've been dealing with. I walked up to the mezzanine level, where there was a microphone set up for speeches and announcements. From up there, I had a perfect view of the entire ballroom. All 300 guests settled into their seats, program books in hand, ready to witness what they thought was going to be a celebration of love and commitment that MY parents were in the third row, just like Nia had promised. Mom looked beautiful in her navy dress with the pearl buttons, and Dad had finally stopped tugging at his tie. They were holding hands and looking around at all the expensive decorations with the kind of quiet pride that comes from watching your kid achieve something important. That was going to be the hardest part. Watching their faces when they realized what was really happening. I took the microphone and cleared my throat. The room gradually quieted as people realized the groom was about to say something. Conversations died down, phones were put away, and all eyes turned toward me with the kind of expectant attention usually reserved for keynote speakers and lottery drawings. "Good afternoon, everyone," I said, and my voice carried clearly through the sound system Teo had perfectly calibrated. "Thank you all for being here today. I know many of you traveled quite a distance to be with us, and that means the world to me." Polite applause rippled through the crowd. Geneva smiled approvingly from her front row seat, probably thinking I was about to deliver some heartfelt speech about love and family and tradition. However, I continued, and the word hung in the air like a warning shot. "There won't be a ceremony today." The applause died instantly. You could have heard a champagne flute drop on the marble floor. 300 people collectively held their breath, waiting for the punchline or the explanation or some indication that this was part of some elaborate pre-wedding tradition they'd never heard of. "Before anyone decides why," I said, keeping my voice level and clear, "please watch this." I looked directly at Teo and gave him the signal. The lights dimmed, and the massive screen came to life. And that's when the real show began. The video quality wasn't perfect. Hotel lighting rarely is, but it was clear enough. Clear enough to see faces, to hear voices, to understand exactly what had been happening while everyone else was planning a celebration. Clear enough to see Sloan laughing at Julian's joke about no one stopping this now. Clear enough to hear Rafi's affectionate comment about me being too trusting. The ballroom erupted into chaos. Gasps, whispers, shocked exclamations, and the distinctive sound of 300 people simultaneously reaching for their phones to capture what was happening. Some guests looked away in embarrassment, others leaned forward for a better view, and a few started heading for the exits like they were witnessing a crime scene. That's when Sloan burst through the ballroom doors. She was wearing her wedding dress, all $10,000 of white silk and lace and designer craftsmanship, and she looked absolutely magnificent in her fury. Her hair was perfect, her makeup was flawless, and her expression was pure rage mixed with panic. "Get that off," she screamed, pointing at the screen like she could make the video disappear through sheer force of will. "Turn it off right now." But Teo, professional that he was, kept the video running. Because I'd asked him to, and because sometimes the truth needs its full moment in the spotlight. Sloan looked up at me on the mezzanine, and in that moment, she said the line that told everyone in that ballroom exactly who she really was. "Get out. You're not supposed to see the bride before the ceremony." The room inhaled collectively. Even in the middle of being exposed as a cheater, even with video evidence of her betrayal playing on a screen the size of a small movie theater, she was worried about wedding superstitions. She was more concerned about tradition than truth, more focused on appearances than accountability. Some people actually nodded, like maybe she had a point. Like maybe the real problem here wasn't the infidelity captured in high definition, but the fact that I'd violated some ancient custom about grooms and brides not seeing each other before the wedding. I kept my voice calm and level, projecting just enough to be heard over the chaos without seeming like I was shouting. "There is no bride," I said simply. "Not to me." And that's when the real chaos began. You know what's beautiful about the digital age? Everything is connected, and if you understand the connections, you can pull exactly the right threads to unravel someone's entire plan in about the time it takes to order a coffee. I'd spent months being the responsible one, the guy who handled logistics and paid attention to details, and it turned out that all that boring administrative work was about to become my superpower. While Sloan was screaming about superstitions and the ballroom was descending into the kind of chaos that makes reality TV producers weep with joy, I pulled out my phone and started making calls. Not angry calls, not dramatic confrontations, just quiet, professional conversations with the kind of efficiency that would make a corporate restructuring specialist proud. First call, the venue's financial coordinator. "Hi, this is Adrian Chun, account holder for the Whitmorton wedding. I need to execute the cancellation clause on our final payment authorization." "Sir, the event is literally happening right now," she said, and I could hear the confusion in her voice mixed with what sounded like distant screaming from the ballroom below. "Yes, I'm aware," I replied calmly. "Please check Section 12 of our contract regarding last-minute modifications and unauthorized additions." The Whitmore family signed addendums, taking financial responsibility for all upgrades made in the final 2 weeks. "I'm canceling my portion of the payment authorization effective immediately." There was typing, probably frantic scrolling through digital contracts. Oh, oh my. Yes, I see the clause here. This puts the penalty charges on. Oh dear. On the Whitmore family, exactly. They wanted control over the final details, so they get to control the final bill. Please process that immediately. Processing now, sir. I'm sorry this is happening. Don't be sorry. This is exactly what's supposed to happen. Second call, the shuttle service coordinator. Trevor, this is Adrian Chun. I need to void the transportation contracts for today's event, effective immediately. Dude, what? We've got 3 buses already en route to pick up guests from the hotel district. This is like 150 people we're talking about. I understand, and I'm sorry for the short notice. But the contract allows for same-day cancellation by the primary account holder, which is me. The Whitmore family will need to arrange alternative transportation. I'll pay the cancellation fee, but the buses need to return to depot. Bro, that's going to leave a lot of people stranded. The Whitmores are going to be pissed. The Whitmores have resources. They'll figure it out. Can you process the cancellation? Yeah, man. Give me the authorization code. I rattled off the numbers I'd memorized that morning, and just like that, 150 wedding guests were about to discover that their ride situation had gotten significantly more complicated. Harold was going to love coordinating peak-rate taxi service for half the city's elite on zero notice. Third call, the Honeymoon Travel Agency. This is Adrian Chun, confirmation number Delta 7749. I need to execute an emergency transfer on the Greece package. Mr. Chun, congratulations on your wedding day. How can I help you? Thank you, but there's been a change of plans. I need to transfer the honeymoon package to Luis and Mara Chun. That's my parents. Full transfer, all amenities, same dates. Sir, this is very unusual. Are you sure about this? Completely sure. My parents have never had a real vacation, and they deserve 2 weeks in Greece a lot more than I do right now. Can you process that transfer? Well, since you're the primary account holder and the package is fully paid, yes, I can do that. Should I send the new confirmations to their email? Please. And make sure they get the upgrade to the Ocean View suite. They've earned it. My parents were going to get the honeymoon I'd planned, and knowing Dad, he'd probably spend the entire trip calculating how much money I'd just given them and trying to figure out how to pay me back. Mom would love the Greek islands, though. She'd always wanted to see the Mediterranean. Fourth call, the joint banking account hotline. This is Adrian Chun, account holder on the shared checking account ending in 4472. I need to execute the infidelity protection clause. Sir, I'll need to verify some information and confirm that you have documentation of the triggering event. I have video evidence with timestamps, recorded this morning. The incident occurred within the 48-hour window specified in our account agreement. I see. This freezes shared access and requires both parties to appear in person with legal representation to resolve asset distribution. Are you certain you want to proceed? Absolutely certain. Processing now, sir. The account will be frozen within 15 minutes. Just like that, Sloane's access to the money we'd been saving for our new life together disappeared faster than her commitment to monogamy. She'd need lawyers and paperwork, and probably her father's accountant to access anything more than pocket change. Fifth call, my insurance company. I need to confirm the beneficiary status on policy number CH 4497-7829. Let me check that for you, sir. Yes, the temporary beneficiary removal is still in effect until after your wedding ceremony. Since the ceremony didn't take place, the original beneficiary designation is permanently voided, correct? That's correct, sir. The policy reverts to your contingent beneficiaries as listed, which meant my parents, not Sloane. Another loose end tied up with the kind of precision that only comes from actually reading insurance paperwork instead of just signing it. The beauty of the whole operation was its elegant simplicity. I wasn't stealing anything or breaking any laws or doing anything that couldn't be explained in calm, professional language to anyone who asked. I was just exercising the legal rights I'd secured when I was a trusting idiot who thought he was planning a life with someone who loved him. Every contract had my signature. Every account had my name as primary holder. Every vendor relationship included clauses that I'd actually read instead of just nodding along with whatever Geneva and Harold wanted. While I was making these calls, the ballroom below was turning into something that would make WWE events look civilized. Through the mezzanine windows, I could see Harold attempting to maintain some kind of damage control, Geneva trying to herd guests toward the exits, and Sloane standing in the middle of it all like a white silk tornado of rage and disbelief. I sent a quick email to the 3 vendor sponsors who'd offered discounted services for brand alignment. The florist, photographer, and catering coordinator who'd wanted social media exposure and association with the Whitmore name. Due to personal circumstances, I'm withdrawing from today's event. Please direct all remaining invoices and coordination requests to the Whitmore family per our signed addendum agreements. Attached is a brief statement for your records. Thank you for your professional service. The statement was 1 page, typed that morning in the same calm, professional tone I'd been using all day. I am ending my engagement due to personal reasons. Any business relationships or financial obligations moving forward should be directed to the Whitmore family, who insisted on being primary coordinators for all vendor relationships per signed addendum agreements. Harold's signature was right there next to mine on every vendor contract, because he'd insisted on being involved in every decision. Now he could be involved in every bill, every cancellation fee, and every awkward conversation with suppliers who'd been expecting a fairy tale wedding and got a social media disaster instead. The whole thing took maybe 20 minutes of phone calls and email management. 20 minutes to systematically dismantle the infrastructure that was supposed to support a lie and hand the consequences back to the people who'd helped create them. That I wasn't touching Rafi physically. That would have been satisfying but stupid. I wasn't touching Julian. He was Sloane's problem, not mine. But I was absolutely touching the money, the logistics, the carefully constructed framework that had turned my wedding into their opportunity. But in one swift, quiet series of moves, I took back everything I could legally take and handed the rest to the people who worshipped appearances. Let them figure out how to pay for their performance. The ballroom had transformed into something that meteorologists would classify as a Category 5 social disaster. You know those nature documentaries where they show hurricanes forming over warm ocean water? That's exactly what was happening, except instead of wind and rain, it was 300 people in formal were experiencing collective shock, outrage, and the kind of second-hand embarrassment that makes you want to crawl under a table and wait for civilization to reset itself. That I stayed on the mezzanine level, watching the chaos unfold below like I was observing some fascinating social experiment from a safe distance. Phones were everywhere, not the discreet, let me check my messages kind of phone usage, but the full-blown, holy shit, I need to document this for posterity variety. People were recording everything. The video still playing on the giant screen, Sloane's meltdown, Harold's attempts at damage control, and Geneva's increasingly frantic efforts to maintain some semblance of dignity while her carefully curated world collapsed in real time. The sound was incredible, like being inside a beehive that someone had just kicked down a hill. Conversations, arguments, shocked gasps, nervous laughter, and underneath it all, the distinctive hum of 300 people simultaneously trying to process what they'd just witnessed. Some guests were heading for the exits like the building was on fire. Others were clustering in groups to dissect every detail. And a few were actually trying to comfort my parents, who looked like they'd been hit by a truck made of pure confusion. Geneva was the first to attempt a counterattack, floating through the crowd in her lilac silk like a general trying to rally troops after a devastating surprise attack. "Please, everyone," she kept saying, her voice carrying that particular strain that comes from trying to sound calm while your entire social structure crumbles around you. There's obviously been some kind of misunderstanding. Perhaps we should all take a moment to, but nobody was listening to Geneva anymore. The video had spoken louder than any explanation she could possibly offer, and 300 people had just watched her daughter laughing about betraying the guy who was currently paying for their entertainment. Harold, meanwhile, was working a different angle. He cornered anyone who looked like they might have influence or media connections, his politician instincts kicking in as he tried to control the narrative before it escaped into the wild. "Family matter," I could hear him saying to a city councilman. "Private business that shouldn't have been made public. You understand how these things can be taken out of context." Out of context, right? Because apparently, there's some magical context where your daughter, your future son-in-law's best friend, and an ex-boyfriend tangled up in a hotel bed becomes a heartwarming story about family values. That's when Sloane decided to try the direct approach. She gathered up her $10,000 worth of white silk and designer craftsmanship and stormed toward the mezzanine stairs like she was leading a charge into battle. The train of her dress swept behind her with the kind of dramatic flair that would have been impressive if she wasn't currently starring in her own public humiliation. "Adrian," she shouted as she climbed the stairs, her voice cutting through the ballroom noise like a fire alarm. "We need to talk. Right now." I waited until she reached the mezzanine level, mainly because I was curious to see what her opening move would be. Would she go with denial? Emotional manipulation? Righteous indignation? The suspense was killing me. She chose righteous indignation, which was honestly the most predictable option, but also the most entertaining. "How dare you embarrass me like this?" she hissed, getting close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume mixed with what I was pretty sure was cologne that didn't belong to me. In front of everyone. In front of my family. "This is insane." "You're right," I said calmly. "It is insane. What you did was insane. Recording it was just good documentation. You had no right to spy on me. Actually, I had every right to investigate when my gut started screaming that something was wrong. Turns out, my gut has better judgment than I do." She tried a different tactic, her voice dropping to that soft, pleading tone that used to make me want to fix whatever was wrong. "Adrian, please. One mistake. One stupid moment. Don't throw away everything we've built together. Everything we built." I laughed, and it came out sharper than I'd intended. "Sloan, I built this. I paid for this. I organized this. You just showed up and looked pretty while I handled everything else. And apparently, while I was building our life, you were building a completely different life with other people." That's when Harold decided to join our little mezzanine conference, bringing Geneva along for moral support and additional outrage. They climbed those stairs like they were ascending to their own execution, which, in terms of their social standing, they probably were. "Adrian," Harold said, and his voice had that particular quality that politicians use when they're trying to sound reasonable while threatening you. "We need to have a private conversation. This whole situation has gotten completely out of hand." "Every conversation was private until last night," I replied, looking directly at him. That was kind of the problem. Geneva tried her own version of damage control, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension that suggested she thought I was having some kind of mental breakdown that could be managed with the right combination of patience and sedatives. "Darling, you're obviously upset, and rightfully so. But this isn't the way to handle family matters. Perhaps we could all sit down somewhere quiet and discuss this like civilized people." "Civilized people don't cheat on their fiancés with their best friends and exes," I said. "Civilized people don't plan weddings while planning betrayals. Civilized people don't make other people pay for parties celebrating lies." Sloan tried one more approach, reaching for my hand like physical contact might somehow reset our entire relationship. "Adrian, we loved each other. We did. Maybe I made a mistake, but what we had was real." I looked down at her hand on mine, the same hand that had been doing God knows what in room 1119 a few hours earlier, and gently pulled away. "I loved us," I said quietly. "You loved attention. There's a difference." That's when the shouting started in earnest. Harold demanding compensation for the damage to the family's reputation. Geneva insisting that I was destroying innocent people with my vindictive behavior. Sloan cycling through every emotional manipulation technique in the book, from tears to anger to promises to threats. But I kept my voice low, steady, and boring, because paperwork beats drama every time, and I had all the paperwork on my side. "Check your contracts," I told Harold when he started threatening legal action. "Check the addendums you signed. Check the insurance clauses and the vendor agreements." Everything I did today was legal, documented, and entirely within my rights as the primary account holder on every single financial instrument involved in this event. Harold went pale as he realized what that meant. All those times he'd insisted on being involved in vendor relationships. All those signatures he'd added to contracts to ensure the Whitmore name was associated with every detail. He'd just made himself financially responsible for a wedding that was never going to happen. "You can't do this," Geneva whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. "I already did it," I replied. "About 20 minutes ago." The beautiful thing about the whole situation was how clean it was. No theft, no vandalism, no assault charges or restraining orders. Just a systematic unwinding of financial obligations and contractual relationships. executed with the kind of precision that comes from actually reading the fine print instead of just trusting people to do the right thing. That I walked toward the mezzanine stairs, leaving them standing there in their formal wear and their shock, processing the reality that their carefully orchestrated social event had just become their very expensive problem. "Where are you going?" Sloan called after me. "Home," I said without turning around. "To pack your things." The last thing I heard as I descended those stairs was Geneva asking Harold in a voice like broken glass, "How much is this going to cost us?" I didn't stick around to hear his answer. I had boxes to pack and a door to close. You'd think that after publicly detonating someone's life in front of 300 witnesses, you'd get at least one quiet morning to drink coffee and contemplate the philosophical implications of justice. But apparently, when you systematically dismantle a Whitmore family production, they don't just sulk quietly in their mansion and accept defeat. No, they show up at your apartment at 8 a.m. like a well-dressed collection agency with trust fund backing and generational entitlement issues. The pounding on my door started before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee, which was honestly just rude. I'd been awake since 5, sitting on my couch in yesterday's clothes, staring at the boxes I'd packed the night before, all of Sloan's belongings, labeled with the kind of obsessive organization that happens when you're running on adrenaline and the need to never see this person's stuff again, that I opened the door to find the full Whitmore delegation. Harold looking like he'd aged 10 years overnight, Geneva clutching a leather portfolio like it contained state secrets, and Sloan wearing designer athleisure that probably cost more than most people's rent. They looked like they'd been up all night plotting strategy, which, knowing them, they probably had. "Adrian," Harold said, pushing past me into my apartment like he owned the place. "We need to discuss compensation." Compensation. The man had balls, I'd give him that. His daughter had been caught cheating on camera. His family's social standing was currently circulating on social media like a viral dance trend, and he wanted to talk about compensation. "Good morning to you too, Harold," I said, closing the door behind them. "Coffee? Aspirin? Reality check." Geneva was already surveying my apartment with the kind of disdain usually reserved for crime scenes or modern art installations. "Adrian, darling, this whole situation has gotten completely out of hand. The phone calls, the social media posts, the rumors, it's simply devastating to the family's reputation. Your daughter's reputation was devastated the moment she decided to turn our hotel block into her personal playground," I replied. "I just provided the documentation." Harold pulled out what looked like a calculator and a stack of receipts that could have choked a horse. "At least 50,000, he announced like he was reading a grocery list. "That's what yesterday's disaster cost us in vendor penalties, transportation fees, and reputation management." I almost laughed. Actually, I did laugh. 50,000? Harold, let me introduce you to a beautiful concept called consequences. It's what happens when your actions have results you don't like. "You deliberately sabotaged our event," Geneva said, her voice taking on that particular pitch that happens when rich people realize their money can't actually fix everything. "You cost us relationships with vendors, embarrassed us in front of our friends, and created a public relations nightmare that's going to follow us for years." "I cost you." I set down my coffee and pulled out my own folder, the one I prepared the night before while packing boxes. "Let me refresh your memory about who actually paid for what." I laid out the contracts on my coffee table like I was dealing cards at a casino. Venue final payment, my credit card. Transportation coordination, my account. Vendor relationships, addendums with your signatures taking financial responsibility for all upgrades and modifications. Insurance policies, beneficiary clauses that automatically void in case of documented infidelity. Harold went pale as he recognized his own signature on document after document. All those times he'd insisted on being involved, on adding his name to vendor relationships, on upgrading everything to reflect the Whitmore standard, he'd been signing himself up to inherit the bill when things went sideways. "This is extortion," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. "This is contract law." I corrected. "You wanted control over every detail, so you got control over every consequence." Congratulations. That's when Sloan decided to try the emotional approach, because apparently, she thought 24 hours was enough time for me to forget what I'd seen in room 1119. "Adrian, we loved each other," she said. and her voice had that practiced quality that suggested she'd been rehearsing this speech. What happened yesterday? It was complicated. There were feelings involved that I didn't know how to handle. But what we had was real. We loved each other. I repeated slowly, like I was testing the words for accuracy. That's an interesting way to phrase it. Past tense. Like something that happened once upon a time before reality set in. Don't be cruel, she whispered, and I could see tears forming in her eyes. Professional-grade tears that would have been impressive if I hadn't spent the last 6 months watching her perform for various audiences. I'm not being cruel, I said gently. I'm being accurate. I loved us. You loved the idea of us, the social status of us, the financial security of us. But you also loved whatever was happening in that hotel room. And you can't love both without destroying one of them. It was a mistake, she said, and now the tears were real. One stupid mistake that I'll regret for the rest of my life. 3 people don't make one mistake, I replied. 3 people make a choice. And choices have consequences. Harold tried to regain control of the conversation by returning to his favorite topic, money. Regardless of the emotional aspects, there are practical matters to consider. The vendors are demanding payment for services that were rendered. The venue is threatening legal action over the disruption. Our insurance company is asking questions about liability. Your insurance company, I corrected. Your vendors. Your legal problems. I fulfilled my obligations under every contract I signed. You're the ones who signed addendums taking responsibility for everything else. I pulled out another folder, this one containing copies of every email I'd sent the day before. I notified all relevant parties that I was withdrawing from the event due to personal circumstances, and that all future coordination should be directed to the Whitmore family per our signed agreements. Everything was handled professionally and according to the terms you insisted on. Geneva was reading over the contracts with the expression of someone discovering that their parachute had been replaced with a decorative handkerchief. These clauses. Harold, did you read these clauses? Of course I read them, he snapped, but his voice suggested he was realizing he maybe should have read them more carefully. The responsibility transfer is automatic, I explained helpfully. The moment I executed my withdrawal rights, all remaining obligations shifted to the secondary signatories. That would be you. I stood up and walked to the pile of boxes I'd packed the night before. Speaking of obligations, these are Sloane's belongings. Everything's been cleaned, folded, and organized. You'll find inventory lists in each box because I believe in proper documentation. Sloane stared at the boxes like they represented the death of every hope she'd ever had. You're really doing this. You're really throwing away everything we built together. I'm not throwing it away, I said quietly. I'm returning it to its rightful owner. You built something, Sloane. Just not with me. I helped them carry the boxes to Harold's car, because despite everything, I was raised to be polite, and watched them load up the physical remnants of our relationship with the efficiency of a moving company. Before they left, Harold made one last attempt at damage control. This isn't over, Adrian. We have resources, we have influence, and we have lawyers. Don't think you can just walk away from this without consequences. Influence fumbles when truth has a timestamp, I replied. And lawyers cost money. How much money do you have left after yesterday's bills come due? They drove away without answering, which was probably answer enough that I went back inside, made fresh coffee, and sat down to write a brief note to the dozen or so wedding guests who'd reached out asking for my side of the story. No details beyond what you saw. I wish everyone well. Then I blocked Rafi's number, blocked Julian's social media accounts, and deleted every contact that connected me to the life I'd been living for the past 2 years. Silence, it turned out, was the heaviest door I'd ever closed, but it was also the only one that stayed shut. Time has this weird way of smoothing over even the sharpest edges, like ocean waves gradually turning broken glass into sea glass, still recognizable as something that was once jagged, but now just smooth enough to hold without bleeding. 6 months after what the local social media circles had dubbed the wedding that wasn't, life had settled into something that felt almost normal, assuming your definition of normal includes being locally famous for the most spectacular relationship implosion in recent memory. The weeks immediately following the ballroom disaster had been interesting, and by interesting, I mean the kind of exhausting that makes you understand why some people just disappear to cabins in Montana and become Hermits who communicate exclusively through cryptic Facebook posts about organic farming. Everyone had opinions about what I'd done, and apparently, everyone felt compelled to share those opinions with me, whether I'd asked for them or not. Some people said I was cruel. These were usually folks who thought that public humiliation was a worse crime than betrayal, the kind of people who would rather suffer in silence than make anyone uncomfortable with messy truths. They'd corner me at the grocery store or the gym, shaking their heads sadly while explaining that there were better ways to handle the situation and some things should be kept private. What they really meant was that I should have quietly broken up with Sloan, let the Whitmores save face, and allowed everyone to maintain their comfortable illusions about how the world worked. The fact that this approach would have left me financially ruined and emotionally destroyed while my ex-fiancé and former best friend rode off into the sunset seemed irrelevant to these particular moral philosophers. Others said I was brave. These were the people who'd been cheated on themselves, or who'd watched friends get systematically destroyed by partners who thought loyalty was optional. They'd buy me drinks and share their own war stories, treating me like some kind of folk hero who'd finally given cheaters the public reckoning they deserved. "You did what we all wish we'd had the balls to do," became a common refrain, usually delivered with the kind of intensity that suggested some serious, unresolved trauma, but most people just moved on to new drama, because that's what people do. Social media has the attention span of a caffeinated goldfish, and there's always fresh scandal to replace yesterday's headlines. Within a month, my wedding disaster had been replaced by a city councilman's embezzlement charges, a high school principal's inappropriate relationship with a parent volunteer, and a local restaurant owner's spectacular meltdown during a health department inspection that I was yesterday's entertainment, which was exactly what I'd been hoping for. The financial aftermath had been surprisingly clean. Harold's lawyers had made some threatening noises about malicious contract manipulation and intentional interference with business relationships, but their case fell apart the moment they actually read the contracts their client had signed. Turns out, when you insist on adding your signature to every vendor agreement while demanding control over every decision, you also get to own every consequence when things go sideways. The final tally was impressive. Venue penalties, vendor cancellation fees, transportation coordination disasters, and what their insurance company politely termed reputational damage mitigation costs. I never got an exact number, but my cousin Nia, who worked in catering and heard everything through the local vendor network, estimated it was somewhere north of $75,000. 75 grand to learn that your daughter's a cheater, she'd said, shaking her head. That's some expensive education right there. I'd paid my parents back slowly, in monthly installments that Luis tried to refuse and Mara tried to triple-check to make sure I wasn't bankrupting myself out of guilt. They'd taken the Greece honeymoon I'd transferred to them and come back looking 10 years younger, full of stories about Mediterranean sunsets and olive groves, and the kind of relaxation that only comes from knowing you've earned every minute of luxury. "Best trip of our lives," Dad had said, showing me approximately 400 photos of ancient ruins and seaside restaurants. "Though I still don't understand why you gave it to us." "Because you deserved it," I'd replied. "And because the people who were supposed to go with me turned out to be fictional characters." The 10 seconds of video footage stayed locked in an encrypted drive, not as a trophy or a weapon, but as insurance against any future attempts to rewrite history. I'd learned that truth has a shelf life if you don't preserve it properly, and people have amazing capacities for convincing themselves that their revised versions of events are more accurate than recorded reality. Sloan had tried to contact me exactly 3 times in the months following the wedding disaster. The first attempt was a long email explaining how the whole situation had been blown out of proportion and how she'd learned from her mistakes and wanted to work things out like adults. I deleted it without responding, because adults don't generally need to learn that cheating on their fiancés is wrong. The second attempt was a phone call at 2 a.m., 3 months later, when she was apparently drunk and feeling nostalgic about the good times we had together. I'd let it go to voicemail and listened to 5 minutes of slurred apologies mixed with accusations that I'd ruined her life over one mistake. I'd save the voicemail, because drunk confessions have a way of revealing what people really think when their filters are down. The third attempt was a carefully crafted social media post about learning to forgive yourself and growing from difficult experiences, tagged with enough mutual friends to ensure I'd see it. It was the kind of vague, inspirational content that looked like personal growth, but was actually a subtle attempt to position herself as the real victim of our relationship's demise. I'd screenshot it, added it to my evidence folder, and then blocked her on every platform I could think of. Rafi had simply vanished from my social universe like he'd never existed. Mutual friends reported that he'd moved to Seattle for a new opportunity, which was probably code for getting as far away as possible from the scene of his crimes. I'd heard through the engineering network that he'd taken a significant pay cut for the relocation, which suggested that his reputation in our local tech community had taken some collateral damage from his starring role in my wedding video. Julian, apparently, had lasted exactly 2 weeks as Sloane's rebound relationship before disappearing back to whatever rock he'd crawled out from under. According to the gossip network that my cousin Nia maintained like a public service, Sloane was currently dating an investment banker from her parents' country club who had the personality of a tax form and the emotional depth of a puddle. Perfect match, Nia had observed. He won't mind that she's already proven she can't be trusted, and she won't mind that he's boring enough to cure insomnia. At work, Syra had promoted me to lead a new project, something quieter and more technical, working with a smaller team on infrastructure improvements that wouldn't require constant client interaction. "You've had enough drama for one lifetime," she'd said when offering me the position. "How about we get you back to solving problems that can actually be fixed with code?" It was exactly what I needed. Problems with clear parameters, solutions that could be tested and verified, and colleagues who cared more about elegant algorithms than social media drama. I'd thrown myself into the work with the kind of intensity that comes from needing something constructive to occupy your brain while the rest of your life reconfigured itself. On a warm Sunday afternoon in late summer, I was helping my mother in her garden when she asked the question I'd been expecting for months. "Do you think you'll ever trust someone again?" she said, not looking up from the tomato plants she was carefully tending. That I considered the question while watching her hands work the soil. The same hands that had packed quiet envelopes with grocery money when wedding expenses got out of control. The same hands that had held mine during the worst of the aftermath. "Not the same way," I said finally. "But better." "Better how?" "Smarter. More careful. With higher standards for what trust actually means." She nodded like that made sense to her. "Your father says you seem lighter now. Like you've put down something heavy you didn't realize you were carrying." She was right. There was a lightness that came from no longer having to pretend that obvious problems were actually minor concerns, no longer having to rationalize behavior that my gut knew was wrong, no longer having to fund someone else's fantasy about who they wanted to be. When people asked what happened, and they still occasionally did, usually at social gatherings where alcohol loosened tongues and lowered social filters, I didn't give them a saga. I gave them the outline. I saw what I needed to see. I told the truth once, publicly and calmly. Then I put the damage back where it belonged and walked away. She'd yelled about superstition. I'd answered with consequences. She'd chased a spectacle. I'd handed her the bill. And somewhere between the screen going black and the door clicking shut, I'd found something I didn't even know I'd lost. Peace with my own judgment, confidence in my own standards, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from handling a crisis with integrity instead of drama. The whispers in my gut had finally gone quiet, not because they'd stopped caring, but because they no longer needed to compete with the noise of other people's expectations. I'd learned to listen the first time, and I'd kept the receipt. My wife left a note on the table. "Don't look for me. I need freedom." So I didn't. I filed for divorce, froze the accounts, and went on vacation. 3 days later, she was waiting outside my lawyer's office in tears. "My name is Marcus Hale. I'm 38 years old. And let me tell you something about Tuesday mornings. They're supposed to be boring as hell. Coffee, toast, maybe catch the tail end of some talking head on the morning news complaining about traffic or the weather. You know, the usual suburban soundtrack of mediocrity. What they're not supposed to include is finding a goddamn Dear John letter sitting on your kitchen table like some kind of twisted breakfast surprise." But there it was, weighted down by Lauren's house key, because apparently even her dramatic exit needed proper staging. For lines written in that elegant cursive she was so proud of, the same handwriting that used to pen love notes and grocery lists. "Don't look for me. I need freedom." That was it. No, dear Marcus. No. I'm sorry this didn't work out. No, it's not you. It's me bullshit that would have at least pretended to soften the blow. Just abandonment wrapped up in politeness like a turd in fancy wrapping paper. I picked up the note, and honestly, my first thought wasn't heartbreak or anger. It was annoyance. Pure, unadulterated irritation at the sheer laziness of it all. 15 years together. 15 fucking years. And this is what I get? A grocery list-length goodbye that probably took her all of 30 seconds to scribble down? I've seen breakup texts with more emotional depth than this masterpiece of passive aggression. Standing there in the silence of our house, I let my eyes wander around the kitchen where we used to eat dinner together. The walls were still covered with our framed photos. Vacations in Cabo, that weekend in Napa Valley where she got so drunk she insisted on buying a $50 bottle of olive oil. Christmas mornings where we looked genuinely happy instead of just Instagram happy. For a moment, I felt something that might have been grief trying to claw its way up my throat, threatening to drown me in all that domestic nostalgia bullshit. But then something else kicked in. Call it survival instinct. Call it emotional compartmentalization. Call it whatever the hell you want. But the calm came washing over me like a cold shower. And with that calm came clarity, crystal fucking clear clarity about who I was dealing with here. Lauren was impulsive. Always had been, always would be. She was the type who'd see a designer dress in a store window and max out a credit card without thinking twice. She'd book spontaneous weekend trips to places we couldn't afford because life's too short not to live a little. She thrived on drama, fed off it like some kind of emotional vampire. Every argument had to be a production, every disagreement a full-scale theatrical performance, complete with doors slamming and dramatic declarations. Me? I was different. I made plans. I thought things through. I weighed consequences and considered outcomes before making decisions that could blow up my entire life. While she was busy making scenes, I was busy making sure our bills got paid on time and our retirement account stayed funded. Boring? Sure. But boring pays the mortgage and keeps the lights on. Looking at that note again, I couldn't help but laugh. Not the bitter, broken laugh of a heartbroken man, but genuine amusement at the beautiful irony of it all. Lauren, who couldn't stick to a diet for more than 3 days or finish a book that didn't have pictures, was lecturing me about commitment. Lauren, who changed her mind about major life decisions like other people change their socks, was talking about needing freedom. The really hilarious part? She actually thought this would destroy me. I could practically see her imagining the aftermath. Me, devastated and desperate, calling her phone 50 times a day, showing up at her work with flowers and apologies, maybe even hiring one of those skywriting planes to beg her to come back. She probably expected me to fall apart, to prove how much I needed her by becoming a complete train wreck in her absence. What she didn't count on was that I'd been emotionally checking out of this marriage for months. Hell, maybe even years. You don't just wake up one day and decide your spouse is insufferable. It's a gradual process, like watching paint peel or ice melt. All those little moments of watching her treat waitstaff like garbage, listening to her complain about her job while refusing to actually do anything to improve her situation, watching her spend money we didn't have on shit we didn't need while I worked overtime to keep us afloat. I walked over to the coffee maker and started my usual morning routine, because what the hell else was I supposed to do? The world doesn't stop spinning just because your wife decides to have a midlife crisis at 35. Coffee still needed to be made, bills still needed to be paid, and I still had to show up to my job and pretend everything was perfectly normal. As the coffee brewed, I found myself actually feeling something I hadn't experienced in years. Relief. Pure, undiluted relief. No more walking on eggshells around her mood swings. No more listening to her bitch about her coworkers while refusing to acknowledge her own contribution to every workplace drama. No more pretending to be interested in whatever new hobby she'd picked up and would inevitably abandon within a month. The house felt different already. Quieter, sure, but not empty. Just peaceful. Like someone had finally turned off a really annoying background noise that you didn't realize was bothering you until it stopped. I poured my coffee, black like always. Lauren used to mock me for not adding sugar, said it was unnecessarily masculine, or some other pseudo-psychological bullshit she'd picked up from whatever self-help podcast was currently rotting her brain. But standing there in my suddenly Lauren-free kitchen, drinking my bitter coffee in blissful silence, I realized something that probably should have scared me, but didn't. I wasn't broken. I wasn't even particularly sad. What I was, for the first time in years, was free to be exactly who I wanted to be without having to negotiate every single decision with someone who treated life like an improvisational theater class. Lauren wanted freedom? Well, congratulations, sweetheart. You just gave us both exactly what we needed. You know what separates the winners from the losers in life? It's not luck, it's not looks, and it sure as hell isn't karma or any of that cosmic justice bullshit. It's speed. The ability to see what's coming and move fast enough to position yourself on the right side of the shitstorm before it hits. While other people are still standing around wondering what the hell just happened, the smart ones are already 3 moves ahead, playing chess while everyone else is still figuring out which end of the checkers pieces goes up. So instead of doing what Lauren probably expected, the whole pathetic ex-husband routine of begging, pleading, and making a complete ass of myself, I did something that would have blown her tiny little mind if she'd been around to witness it. I acted like a goddamn adult with a functioning brain. My first call went to Walter Chun, and let me tell you something about Walter. This guy doesn't just practice law, he performs surgical strikes on people's lives with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. He's the kind of divorce attorney who makes other divorce attorneys wake up in cold sweats. The man has dismantled more messy marriages than a demolition crew working overtime, and his reputation in this town is legendary. When people hear you've got Walter Chin on your side, they don't just lawyer up, they start praying to whatever deity they think might help them survive the legal apocalypse that's about to rain down on their heads. Marcus, Walter said when he picked up, his voice carrying that perfect blend of sympathy and predatory satisfaction that only comes from years of practice. I heard through the grapevine that you might be in need of my services. Lauren finally pulled the trigger on that exit strategy she's been telegraphing for months. See, that's another thing about Walter. The guy has his finger on the pulse of this town's relationship drama, like some kind of marital seismologist. He probably knew my marriage was headed for the rocks before I did. Hell, he probably had my file ready to go before Lauren even found a pen to write that pathetic excuse for a goodbye note. She left a note this morning. I told him, and I could practically hear him rubbing his hands together with glee. 4 lines. No explanation, no discussion, just don't look for me. I need freedom and her house key. Beautiful, Walter said, and I could tell he meant it. Abandonment without cause. Clean cut, no ambiguity. This is going to be easier than taking candy from a baby. How fast can you get to my office? But before I headed over to start the legal demolition of my marriage, I had another call to make. The bank. Now, here's where having a background in finance comes in handy. I know exactly how the system works, and more importantly, I know how to make it work for me. Hi, this is Marcus Hale, I said to the customer service rep, slipping into my most concerned citizen voice. I need to report compromised cards on all my joint accounts. My wife and I discovered some suspicious activity this morning, and we want to freeze everything immediately while we sort this out. It's amazing how easy it is to protect your assets when you frame it as protecting both of your assets. One little white lie about compromised cards, and boom, every joint account frozen tighter than a nun's knees. Lauren's credit cards, her debit cards, her access to the checking account, the savings account, even that little emergency fund she thought I didn't know she dipped into for her shoe shopping binges. All of it locked down while the bank conducted their security investigation. The beautiful part? It was all perfectly legal. I wasn't stealing anything, wasn't hiding assets, wasn't doing anything that could come back to bite me in court. I was simply exercising my rights as a joint account holder to protect our mutual financial interests during a period of potential security compromise. If Lauren had stuck around to discuss our marital issues like an adult instead of leaving passive-aggressive notes and disappearing into the night, maybe we could have handled this differently. But she made her choice, and I made mine. Of course, Lauren didn't know about my private fund. 3 years of carefully socking away bonuses and overtime pay into an account that had only my name on it. Not secret money, not hidden assets, just good old-fashioned personal financial planning that I'd been smart enough to keep separate from our joint finances. Call it a rainy day fund, call it insurance against exactly this kind of situation, call it whatever you want. The point is, while Lauren was about to find herself financially screwed, I was sitting pretty with enough cash to weather this storm and come out the other side in better shape than when it started. After I finished playing financial defense, I decided to take a little walk through our house. Correction, my house, since Lauren had so thoughtfully abandoned any claim to it along with everything else in her life. Walking into our bedroom, I saw the evidence of her hasty retreat scattered around like the aftermath of a fashion emergency. Her side of the closet was half empty, but not in any logical way. She'd taken all her designer dresses. Naturally, because God forbid she sacrifice her precious wardrobe for something as trivial as a marriage, but she'd left behind her old sneakers, the ratty ones she wore for gardening and weekend errands. She'd grabbed her jewelry box, but left her college textbooks. She'd packed her fancy lingerie but abandoned the photo from our honeymoon that used to sit on her nightstand. That mix of carelessness and calculation told me everything I needed to know about Lauren's mindset. This wasn't some impulsive breakdown or emotional crisis. This was planned, deliberate, and coldly strategic. She'd taken everything she considered valuable and left behind everything that reminded her of our life together. The sneakers, the books, the photos, those were just remnants of a life she was discarding like last season's fashion trends. But here's the thing that really got me. She'd left behind the expensive coffee machine I'd bought her for Christmas last year. The one she'd specifically requested, the one she'd researched for weeks, the one she'd claimed would change our morning routine forever. $800 worth of Italian engineering, sitting there on the kitchen counter like it meant absolutely nothing to her. That's when it really hit me. Lauren hadn't left me for freedom. She'd left me because she thought I'd be too weak, too dependent, too emotionally devastated to fight back. She figured she could waltz back into my life whenever she felt like it, maybe after her little adventure ran its course, and find me exactly where she left me, waiting with open arms and a joint bank account ready for her to raid. Well, sweetheart, I thought, looking around at the evidence of her calculated abandonment, you just made the biggest tactical error of your life. You know what's funny about having 2 weeks of approved vacation time sitting in your back pocket? It's like holding a get-out-of-jail-free card that you never thought you'd actually need to use. I'd been saving those days for some bullshit couples retreat that Lauren had been pushing for months. One of those overpriced weekend getaways where they make you do trust exercises and talk about your feelings, while some granola-eating life coach charges you $3,000 to tell you what any bartender could have told you for the price of a beer. Well, guess what? Change of plans, sweetheart. Instead of wasting my hard-earned vacation days on relationship therapy that was clearly never going to work anyway, I decided to do something that Lauren had always mocked me for, something she'd roll her eyes at and dismiss as Marcus being boring again. I was going hiking, alone, for the entire 2 weeks. Hiking is just walking, but with more mosquitoes, she used to say whenever I'd suggest a weekend trip to the mountains. Why would anyone voluntarily choose to sweat that much when we could be at a nice resort with room service and a pool? That was Lauren in a nutshell. If it didn't come with a spa menu and complimentary champagne, it wasn't worth her precious time. To me, though, hiking was peace. It was the kind of silence that actually meant something, not the angry, passive-aggressive silence that had been filling our house for months. It was the chance to think without someone constantly interrupting with complaints about their coworkers or demands to rearrange the living room furniture for the 15th time this year. I called my boss, told him I needed to take my vacation time immediately due to family circumstances, which was technically true, since my family had just imploded thanks to my wife's sudden case of wanderlust. He was cool about it, probably figured I was dealing with some kind of crisis. Which, again, technically accurate. Then I packed my gear. My real gear. Not the designer hiking boots Lauren had bought me for Christmas that were about as practical for actual hiking as high heels would be for mountain climbing. I'm talking about my old, broken-in boots that had carried me through dozens of trails over the years. My weathered backpack that had seen more action than a war correspondent. My sleeping bag that actually kept you warm instead of just looking good in outdoor magazine photo shoots. Before I left, I walked through the house one more time, making sure everything was locked down tight. I tucked Lauren's pathetic excuse for a goodbye note into my desk drawer, right next to the folder where I kept our important documents. Something told me I might need it later for legal purposes, and Walter had already drummed into me the importance of documentation in divorce proceedings. The drive up to the mountains was pure therapy. Every mile I put between myself and that house, between myself and the life that Lauren had just blown up without warning, felt like shedding dead skin. I rolled down the windows, cranked up some classic rock that Lauren always complained was too aggressive for her sensitive ears, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could actually breathe. The trail I chose was one I'd done before, back in my single days before Lauren came along, and convinced me that my weekends should be spent at farmers markets and wine tastings instead of doing things I actually enjoyed. It was a 3-day loop through some seriously beautiful wilderness, the kind of place where your cell phone becomes a useless piece of expensive plastic and your biggest worry is whether you remembered to pack enough trail mix. Setting up camp that first night, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, complete and total ownership of my time. No negotiations about what to watch on TV. No discussions about what to have for dinner. No listening to Lauren's play-by-play analysis of whatever workplace drama was currently consuming her life. Just me, my campfire, and the kind of silence that